Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming. A special hello to our fellows and alumni from our flagship course at Terra.do Climate Change Learning for Action, and also hello to any members of the public joining us from outside the Terra.do community. You can find out more about us by going to our website, of course, and our next cohort of Learning for Action will be launching in March if you're interested. But an especially warm welcome to our guest speaker for today, Professor Saleemul Huq. Saleemul is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and also a professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh. He's also an associate of the International Institute on Environment and Development in the UK, as well as the chair of the Expert Advisory Group for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and a senior advisor on locally led adaptation with the Global Center on Adaptation in the Netherlands. He's also been a lead author of the third, fourth, and fifth assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he also advises the Least Developed Countries Group in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So I don't know how you found the time to come and join us today, Saleemul, but thank you so much. He was, of course, also recognized with an OBE last month, which was very well deserved. It's a great privilege to have you with us, Saleemul, and thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Liam. And hello to everybody, whatever time zone you are in, morning, afternoon, or evening. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you and to be invited to this course and to talk to you. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the different affiliations and hats that I wear that Liam just mentioned, I'd say my primary hat is my teaching hat. I'm a professor at a university in Bangladesh called the Independent University Bangladesh. We run a master's program in climate change and development there. I also run a center, a research center called the International Center for Climate Change and Development based at that university, where we do a lot of work primarily on adaptation to climate change in vulnerable countries, not just Bangladesh, but in other vulnerable countries. And now increasingly on a new and emerging topic on loss and damage, which I will speak about. At the same time, I have been a lead author and coordinating lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, third, fourth, and fifth assessment reports on chapters on adaptation in Working Group 2, which is on vulnerability, adaptation, and impacts. I'm not a current lead author. The current cycle is sixth assessment report, which is coming out over the coming months. But I have been a lead author in IPCC for many years. And then I also have a role in the UN Framework Convention discussions in the annual conferences of parties. I happen to be one of the very few people that's been to every single one of the 26 COPs that have been held so far. But I hasten to add that I don't go to the COP as a negotiator. I go as an observer, but I also have a official role, which is as an advisor to the group of least developed countries. This is a formal caucus group of 47 poor countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, including my country, Bangladesh. And I have been advising that group, currently chaired by Senegal, for many years, initially on adaptation and now on loss and damage. So I'm going to triangulate between these three worlds that I have a foot in, namely the science of the IPCC, global policy making of the UNFCCC, and work on the ground with vulnerable communities. That is, I would say that's my day job, and the other two are part-time jobs. And the way I'll do it, and I apologize for not having any visuals or slides, is I'm just going to tell you a story, tell you my story or my take on the climate change story as it has evolved over the last 30 years, and then open up to take your questions and comments and have a more interactive session with you, all of you. So I welcome any comments or questions you might have as we go along. So my story begins 30 years ago with the first assessment report of the IPCC coming out in the mid-80s, well over 30 years ago. that alerted the world to the fact that greenhouse gas emissions caused by burning fossil fuels like coal, petroleum, and natural gas have accumulated in the global atmosphere, absorbing the sun's rays and causing global warming and temperature rise. That was the first global scientific alert that came to all of us, the world, and particularly to global leaders. And the global leaders then took that message and did something with it. And I'd like to point out some key individuals who played a very key role with that message and information that came from the scientific community to the politicians. And two of them were the Prime Minister of the UK at that time, Margaret Thatcher, and the then Environment Minister of Germany, Angela Merkel. And so these two individual leaders happened to have a science background. Margaret Thatcher studied chemistry in university, and Angela Merkel was actually a professor of physics before she became a politician. They understood the science. You know, Margaret Thatcher didn't need to be convinced about the science. She read the IPCC report and she said, this is serious, this is real. We need to do something about it. And the science advisor at that time, who's just passed away a few days ago, Sir Crispin Tickell, tells this story. You know, he's been telling it for a long time, of how she's the one who told him that he needed to do something about it. He didn't have to tell her that it needed something to be done. And she was very instrumental in getting leaders of that time, like, you know, the previous George Bush Senior, to agree to negotiate the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Nowadays, we don't associate the Conservative Party with a particularly strong climate change, pro-climate change action bent. But at that time, she was actually a world leader in making this happen. And they negotiated the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which brought all countries together to tackle the issue, to agree to tackle the issue. It was a treaty. Countries agreed to take action, and they agreed to reduce their emissions of the greenhouse gases that caused the problem. And the way that the countries deal with that or address the treaty is that every year they meet together, usually at the end of the year, November, December, at a big conference of parties where all the country governments come together and they take stock of how much they've done, not done, decide to take more actions, etc. And the first conference of parties was held in Germany, in Berlin. And as I said at that time, the environment minister of Germany, usually the host country's environment minister is the president of the COP. And in that case, the president of the COP was Angela Merkel as the environment minister of Germany. And she's the one who negotiated the decision, the COP1 decision that then led to the Kyoto Protocol in COP3 a couple of years later in Kyoto, where all countries agreed to take action. So the two arenas have been the science arena of the IPCC and the policymaking arena of the UNFCCC. And each successive report of the IPCC has galvanized further action from the policymakers. That's sort of been the two-step process. IPCC comes up with a new report, the policymakers then respond to that and take action or agree to take action. And over the years, the way I characterize the evolution, and we have evolved in our knowledge and our thinking on climate change, is I characterize it into three eras of the climate change issue. And the eras are defined by the statement of the problem, and the way you state a problem defines by itself what the solution to that problem needs to be. And the first statement of the problem was, as I've already mentioned, emissions of greenhouse gases that cause climate change, that cause global warming. And therefore, the solution to that is let's reduce those emissions. In the climate change jargon, we call that mitigation. So the first era of tackling climate change is mitigation, take action to reduce emissions. However, we haven't been very good at doing that. Emissions still keep going up. Even though we've agreed to reduce them, we're trying to reduce them, lots of actions to reduce them taking place, they're not succeeding. they are continuing to go up. And so around the time of the third assessment report of the IPCC, which is at the turn of the century in 2001, is also when I first became a lead author of the IPCC in Working Group 2, which is on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. The outcome of the third assessment report was the scientists telling the policymakers, you haven't done enough. Emissions keep going up and warming is going to happen. And so just cutting emissions isn't going to be enough. There is a certain amount of emission out there, which is already going to cause global warming. And we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to adapt, whether we like it or not. And so we had a second phase, second era, what I call the era of adaptation. It didn't replace mitigation. We still have to do mitigation, but it's a new solution. This is about impacts that are going to happen, and we are going to have to adapt to those impacts. Now, the second message of impacts and adaptation came with a corollary to it. The corollary was that impacts will happen everywhere in all parts of the globe eventually, but they will happen first in the poorest parts of the globe. So the poorest citizens of planet Earth living in the poorest countries will feel the impacts of climate change first. And what that did was it brought in a brand new cohort of stakeholders who had so far not been involved. The previous era of environment looked at the problem as an environmental problem, and it was the domain of environment ministries. Even now, the Conference of Parties is primarily ministers of environment coming together and agreeing on things. But the second era of adaptation brought forward the need to engage with the poor communities in poor countries who were so far disengaged from the process. They may have been represented at the UNFCCC meetings, but they really didn't know very much about it. And particularly the development world didn't know much about it. The likes of, the DFID in the UK, now called FCDO, or the World Bank or development banks, the development sector, or large international NGOs like Oxfam and so on, they didn't know anything about climate change. And that's around the time when I started my work at IIED in London, the International Institute for Environment and Development, where I used to go and talk to these development people in the government as well as in the NGOs and tell them that they need to take climate change seriously because it was a new message for them. They hadn't thought about climate change as an issue, but they've begun to realize that. And over time, they all now are on board. The developing countries, the development sector now realize climate change is a very big risk for them, and they need to know more about it, and they need to know how to adapt to it. And so adaptation came into its own in the global discourse. Finance for loss and damage, for adaptation for the poor countries became an issue that got negotiated every year, and promises made, not necessarily kept, but certainly made. And this has since then been a big issue in the global discussions and negotiations. And then we had the pinnacle of success in the global negotiations was 6 years ago, or now almost 7 years ago, in 2015, at the 21st Conference of Parties that was held in Paris. That generated the Paris Agreement. That was really the pinnacle of success of a global agreement. The previous one was the Kyoto Protocol, which was, a partial success. It didn't work very well, but it did something. The Paris Agreement was the major achievement in all countries agreeing to reduce their emissions, to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees, to invest in adaptation. The rich countries offered $100 billion a year to the poorer countries to tackle climate change. And we also agreed to now start talking about the potential loss and damage from human-induced climate change, a new area of discourse, as it were. Now, fast forward to 2021 and the 26th Conference of Parties, COP26, which took place just a few months ago in Glasgow in Scotland, hosted by the United Kingdom. A very significant, so first of all, the Glasgow COP26 was supposed to have originally been held in November of 2020. The previous COP25 was held in Madrid in Spain in 2019. So the next one would have been a year later in Glasgow in 2020. But because of the COVID pandemic outbreak, it got postponed by a year and was then held 2 years later in November of 2021. But a significant issue about that is that climate change didn't take a year off. Climate change went ahead and happened. And I ascribe a precise date when we actually knew it was happening, and that is the 9th of August, 2021, a few months before the COP, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Working Group 1, who are the scientists, so the IPCC has 3 working groups. Working Group 1, who do the science of the climate models. Working Group 2, which I belong to, who look at impacts and adaptation. And Working Group 3, who look at mitigation and actions going forward. And their reports come out, they're big reports, very big reports. They take years and years to prepare, and then they all have to be approved by government. So once they're approved, they're actually, like Bibles. No country can oppose the IPCC because it has been approved by their government. And the IPCC Working Group 1 report came out on the 9th of August. And for the first time, the Working Group 1 scientists, who are very conservative scientists, don't like sticking their heads above the parapet, actually said that they now had, for the first time, unequivocal evidence of human-induced climate change impacts occurring that they can attribute to human-induced climate change, to the fact that global temperature has gone up above 1 degree due to human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases. That's the first time they've said it. And it is now very, very true. So going into COP26, COP26 was the first COP in this new era. It's the third era that I am describing, which is the era of loss and damage from climate change. We are now living in that era. Every single day, climate impacts are going to happen somewhere in the world, and somebody's going to be affected. A weather pattern extreme is going to be broken. If you watch the news, you'll see the northeast of the US is having a cyclone bomb, a snowstorm, a heavy snowstorm. In Scotland, just in the last 48 hours, there was a storm and 2 people lost their lives. Okay, so every single day, somewhere in the world, there is an extreme weather event that is happening. It's not happening because of climate change, but the severity is increased because of the temperature rise by over 1 degree, and is therefore attributable to human-induced climate change, even if you don't think it might be. It is. And so we are now living in this era of impacts of climate change attributable to human-induced climate change that is now causing loss and damage. And therefore, dealing with loss and damage is now a reality. Now, I'll move on to this topic of loss and damage and how it has evolved over time. It's an issue that the vulnerable developing countries have been raising for some time now, but have been getting a lot of pushback from the developed countries, particularly the United States of America, because they feel that admitting loss and damage from climate change opens them up for liability and compensation as polluters. And the very terms, liability and compensation, are taboo terms. We are not allowed to use them in the negotiation because the rich countries don't allow us to use it. That's the hegemony they have on language. The term liability and compensation is taboo, cannot be used. But we managed to get them to agree to loss and damage as a neutral term that we can at least talk about. And so in COP19, in the 19th Conference of Parties in Warsaw some years ago, we got them to agree to set up something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage with an executive committee and a work program, which is essentially a talk shop, talking about it, discussing what it does it mean, what can we do about it. And since then, in 2019, in COP25 in Madrid, we, the vulnerable countries, and I've been very involved in that negotiation with the least developed countries and other vulnerable country groups coming together and making a very strong stand for finance for loss and damage. We said, talk about loss and damage is good. We've done quite a lot of talking and discussion, but we now need finance for loss and damage because it's a reality. In Madrid, we didn't get that. What we got was the agreement to set up something called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to do more refined research and knowledge generation and sharing that, technical assistance to countries, but not on finance. In Glasgow, we again tried to do this. In the COP negotiations, if any of you followed them, you may know this, that until the last minute, which was the last day of the official COP, which was Friday evening of the second week of the COP, the developing countries collectively, all developing countries together, 138 countries representing 5 billion people, pushed for language that would agree to set up the Glasgow facility for finance for loss and damage as an outcome of the Glasgow Climate Pact. That language was in the text, draft text, until the very last day. But then the COP26 presidency extended the time for another 24 hours. So everybody had to, cancel flights home. Many people weren't able to cancel flights, had to leave. We went into Saturday, an extra day. And by the time we came back on Saturday, the text had been changed. We learned later at the insistence of the United States, and the Glasgow facility had been changed to a Glasgow dialogue. So what they have agreed to, this is now in the Glasgow Pact, is a Glasgow dialogue on finance for loss and damage for 2 years. So they want to talk about it for another 2 years. They're not going to do anything about it. They're going to just talk for another 2 years. We're not giving up. We're going to try and get the facility agreed in next COP, which is in November this year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The vulnerable countries are going to be taking it very seriously. Egypt is going to be taking it much more seriously as the COP president next time than the UK did as the COP president this time. And so something that is very much a political issue, but also now increasingly a practical issue as the impacts of climate change are happening all over the world. It is no longer just poor countries like Bangladesh that are suffering the impacts. We've been doing that for the last 10 years and nobody cared. But now the UK, Germany lost over 150 people in a flash flood just a few months before Glasgow. United States is being hit, Canada is being hit, all over the world, everybody's being hit, and they're realizing that the impacts of climate change are not going to spare anyone, including the rich countries. And by the way, they're not very well prepared to deal with it. In fact, I would argue Bangladesh, being a very vulnerable, poor country, is much better prepared to deal with these events than even many of the rich countries. Just to give you an example, the German flash flood that took more than 150 German lives would not happen in Bangladesh. We get floods 10 times that big and we don't lose that many lives anymore. We have one of the best evacuation warning systems in the whole world. Millions of people get warnings and evacuate and don't die anymore. Still a lot of damage, but they don't die anymore. And so the Germans could certainly learn from Bangladesh on how to adapt and be better prepared and minimize the loss and damage that they are suffering. So going forward, this is now a burgeoning new topic, issue, highly politically sensitive, but nevertheless something that the developing countries are pushing for. Before I end, I'll just mention one other outcome that took place in Glasgow while we were in Glasgow, and that is outside the blue zone of the UN Framework Convention. So the COP was taking place within a big conference center called Blue Zone, where all the heads of government were talking and speaking and negotiating. But when we stepped out of that blue zone into the city of Glasgow, the city of Glasgow is actually in the country of Scotland, and that Scotland was also our host country. The UK was the official host as the president of the COP, but Scotland was also our host. The people of Scotland, the people of Glasgow were our host, and Scotland has a government of its own. It has a budget of its own. It has a climate fund of its own. And the First Minister of Scotland at the very beginning of the COP actually put £1 million from her climate fund into a brand new loss and damage fund. She created it. And she challenged other world leaders to put in money to match her. And over the course of the 2 weeks that we were in Glasgow, a number of people joined. The province of Wallonia in Belgium put in €1 million. A few international foundations put in the order of a few million euros and dollars. And then at the end of the COP, Nicola Sturgeon double the amount of money that she was putting in from 1 million to 2 million pounds. So we now have a pot of money outside the UN Framework Convention of about 10 million euros or dollars or so, which is not a huge amount of money, but it's a start and it's not zero. Because in the UNFCCC, the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, they didn't offer a single dime, a single dollar, a single euro. In fact, they offered to talk about it for another 2 years. That's all they offered. That's not good enough. And so we are going to be challenging them again. And we are in active discussions with the government of Scotland and Nicola Sturgeon's group on how we can get that ball rolling with the money that they have put on the table and bring in other actors outside the official UNFCCC negotiating countries and hopefully shame the countries into doing things as well, because it's an absolute embarrassment for them to refuse to give any money. I'm going to stop there and happy to take on questions if anybody has them. Let me just add one final thought for all of your audience here. So one of the critical elements of this third era of climate change that I have just described, coming out of COP26, is one in which we, and when I say we, I mean all of us as individuals, now have to take actions ourselves and not depend on our leaders who have let us down. They aren't going to do a damn thing, or they will promise to do it and then they won't do it. So we've seen that for 30 years, they've been doing that. We have to take things into our own hand. We have to take actions. And the way I characterize what our actions need to be is firstly, to think of ourselves as part of the solution, not part of the problem, where each of us, we are responsible for emissions of greenhouse gases due to the food we eat. If we eat more meat, we're a bigger emitter. The house we live in, the bigger the house, the bigger our carbon footprint. The transport we do, if we travel by air a lot, then we have a much bigger carbon footprint. So we all have a carbon footprint that makes us a polluter, which we can reduce our pollution, but we can't reduce it to zero. So we should do what we can to reduce our own carbon footprint, but at the same time, we should also take other kinds of action to join forces with other actors. And this will be completely dependent on who we are, where we live, what we do, what our profession is, who we might be able to interact with, find allies to work with and work with them. And finally, because this is a global problem, link up globally, link up with groups, like-minded groups across the globe. And we are now, we're doing this virtual talk right now, connecting with people all over the world. We have the ability to connect with people all over the world. My center in Bangladesh runs an annual conference on what we call locally led adaptation with local adapters. The next conference is going to be from the 27th of March to the 1st of April. It's called Gobeshona, which is a Bangla word for research. I can put a link in the chat box if people are interested. And we bring together, it's a virtual conference. We run it 24/7, 24 hours. We follow the sun, the first 8 hours in the Asia Pacific region, and then the second 8 hours in the Africa, Europe time zones, and then a third 8 hours in the Americas, North, South, and Central, and then back again around the world, seven days in the whole week. And we have sessions from all over the world of local actors, local adapters. So if any of you are interested to participate, please do. If anybody wants to run a session, you'd be most welcome to pitch it. We are now taking applications for running a session that can be run during the conference itself. And as I said, it's all virtual and on virtual platforms. So I'll stop there. I'll take questions. Liam, do you want to field them, or shall I?
Yes, thank you so much, Saleemul. And before we go on to questions, I'm going to say a couple of words and then ask you to go into a bit more detail on one particular topic, because I'm super interested in that. But just to clarify for everyone, we have set up a Slido page where folks can enter their questions, and I encourage the fellows from our course to write their questions in there so that we can prioritize those. And in there, you can also kind of upvote the ones that you're most interested in and would like to see asked. So folks from our current cohort, please go to the link I posted on Slack and find the Slido there. If we find we get through all of those, then I will open it up to questions from the floor from the whole meeting. I'm not posting the link here on the meeting because I'm wanting to prioritize those folks on the course at the moment. And that's the easiest way for me to do it. But if we get through those, then I'll open it up on here. And so again, folks, I can see folks have raised their hands. Please use the chat if you do want to make any points, or the Slido if you want to ask your questions there. And then we'll move on, and we can turn it into more of a discussion once we cover some of the key points. But before we go into any of that, Saleemul, I just wanted to ask you to maybe outline a little bit more about the adaptation work in Bangladesh. Like you were talking about the things that have been put into place to deal with things like flash floods and extreme events. What does that look like on the ground? How has the work you've been going over the last few years, and what are you working on right now?
Sure. So I mentioned Bangladesh as being one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. It's a combination of our geography and our population. The geography being we sit on the delta of two of the biggest rivers in the world, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. And we are a very small country, only 144,000 square kilometers. And we have a very large population of well over 160 million people. That is more than 1,000 people per square kilometer. That's sort of the density of a city like London or Hong Kong or Singapore rather than a country. And we are a relatively poor country. We're one of the least developed countries. And because of our geography, the flooding from the rivers, cyclones coming in from the Bay of Bengal in our coastal zone, very low-lying coastal region susceptible to sea level rise and salinity intrusion, which is a reality that's happening already. We have known about our vulnerability for some time now. And over the last, I would say, decade and a half, we have been taking actions to figure out what to do. We've assessed what the most vulnerable regions are, people are, locations are, different climate impacts are. And as a result, we have also developed national plans to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We were one of the first countries to create something called the Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. And the government of Bangladesh for the last more than 10 years has been investing its own money in implementing activities, mainly to do adaptation to climate change because of our vulnerability, but some also to do on mitigation to reduce our emissions. But we're not a big emitter, so reducing emissions is not a high priority. It's not zero priority, but it's not a high priority. Adaptation is by far the biggest priority. And over the years, we have done a lot. We've done hundreds of projects. The government agencies and ministries have all acquired capacity and knowledge on what to do. And now we've mainstreamed finance for climate change into the national budget. In fact, the last national budget, the current one, has 8% of the national budget. It's the highest in any country in the world, allocated to more than 25 ministries of the government. And then 10% of the money is allocated to civil society, NGOs, to work on adapting to climate change. And so the country is now well on the path to finding out ways. We haven't solved all the problems, but we are certainly on a path to handling climate impacts and dealing with them. And I'll mention two places where we have done quite a lot of success. The first one is in the early warning systems, particularly for cyclones. As I mentioned, we used to get hit by cyclones. It's a natural phenomenon. Cyclones are not caused by climate change. They get worse because of climate change, but they don't get caused by climate change. And in the past decades, when we've had major cyclones, they have caused deaths in the hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives to cyclones. In the interim period, in the last decade or more, we have improved our cyclone warning system. We have built shelters all over the coast. We have provided learning for people to know what to do in the face of a cyclone. And we can now warn more than 3 million people when a cyclone warning comes. And we had a big super cyclone about a year and a half ago in May of 2020 called Amphan. And super cyclones of that magnitude in the past decades had killed hundreds of thousands of people. In the case of Amphan, 3 million people got the warning and took shelter. And the number of deaths were in the few dozens. and most of them were fishermen who were out at sea and didn't get back to land in time. Almost everybody who was on land got the warning and went to a shelter. And that's by far the most effective cyclone warning system in the whole world, in my view. That's one very good example of Bangladesh's capacity to deal with these kinds of disasters. We still had a big cyclone. It still caused a lot of damage. In fact, a year after the cyclone hit us, I sent a number of my researchers with some journalists to visit the cyclone affected areas, and they found tens of thousands of people who had survived the cyclone but were not able to go home because their homes were destroyed, and they were living in embankments and slums of the nearest towns. So they had saved their lives, but their livelihoods had been lost. And that's a good example of what loss and damage from climate change is. We prevented their loss of human lives, but we weren't able to prevent the loss of their livelihoods. And they effectively have become climate refugees. Many of them have moved to Dhaka city, for example. So that's an example. Another example of adaptation at scale is the low-lying coastal zone of Bangladesh, which I said is now being affected by saline intrusion. Sea level rise is now gradually, it's a very slow onset phenomena creeping in. And if you were to visit that area, you will actually taste the salt water in the water that people have to drink. And the human body can tolerate some salt, but there is a limit to that. And some people have a higher threshold, particularly pregnant women. So pregnant women taking in saline water leads to hypertension, that leads to preeclampsia at childbirth, and this has been well documented as happening. And as a result, the government and NGOs have all invested very heavily in providing fresh drinking water to people by enabling them to do rainwater harvesting. So if you go down to the coast of Bangladesh and you travel, you'll see every house has a rooftop rainwater harvesting system and a tank where they harvest the monsoon rain in the tank, and then they use that for drinking only during the dry season. The salinity period is a short couple of months. It's not year round, and during the monsoon that's not a problem, but it is during the dry season. And they capture water for drinking purposes, and everybody drinks fresh water now in that local area. And I'm talking about tens of millions of people. These are at scale. People are doing it themselves. They know what to do. They are investing in it, and they're adapting to the conditions as we speak. And these are just a few examples of many, many more activities that are being done to adapt to the impacts of climate change across the country at scale. I hope that answers your question, Liam.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Saleemul. Thanks a lot. So I'm going to just pick a couple of questions from Slido and we'll see how we get on. So the most popular so far is, what do you see as the best tactics for escalating pressure on rich countries to contribute to loss and damage?
Well, I see the best tactic as informing the population. Of people like yourselves. You need to be the ones that take action, push your leaders to take action, and if the leaders that you have don't take action, then replace those leaders with better leaders. And that's really the way forward for me. And also I think of it in generational terms, because again, to hark back to what happened in Glasgow, inside the blue zone of the UNFCCC, the leaders were all old people, most of them old men, a few women as well, the women leaders by far better than the men leaders. And outside the blue zone, there were tens of thousands of young people demonstrating. Greta Thunberg, a Swedish teenager, was there, and they were demanding action, but the leaders inside didn't listen to them. And so we need to change our leaders, and we need to take actions ourselves. So that's, to me, the big segue is there's no more bystanders anymore. We can't just sit back and blame people. We're going to have to do something about it, all of us together, and be better at doing it. And that includes changing the attitudes of our governments or changing the governments themselves.
Excellent, thanks, Saleemul. I was there outside in Glasgow last November, shouting from the outside, but not the inside. Yeah. So relatedly, someone was asking, are there any kind of win-win techniques or mechanisms that can add that pressure to rich countries in a way that incentivizes them, without kind of getting sucked into the, the World Bank style of aggressive loans that actually end up making things worse for those vulnerable countries. Are there any other kind of win-win situations you can think of?
Well, I feel that the best solution is what I call solidarity amongst all of us, everybody on this call, thinking that we need to do something and reaching out to others, whether in the course or other people that you know. And from my perspective, sitting in Bangladesh, as I said, we run this network of local adapters called Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research. I see my colleague has put the website in the chat box, so feel free to go and connect with us. We'll be having a big conference from the 27th of March onwards. Participate in, link up with others. And to me, we needn't think of global action, only global leaders coming together once a year at COP. We need to think of other ways of global action by citizens themselves. And a good example that I would cite is the school kids Fridays for Future, that was inspired by Greta Thunberg's, every Friday she would skip school and sit in front of the Swedish parliament with a placard saying that she was on strike by herself. And then now millions of school kids every Friday come out of school and are demonstrating, and they're going beyond demonstrations. They're now taking actions as well. And so to me, we need to find alternative models of global solidarity and global action that don't rely on leaders taking the lead and doing things right, because leaders have so far let us down.
Thanks, Saleemul. On the same topic of the global negotiations, where would you say there have been the wins so far from for example, from the least developed countries bloc or some of the other vulnerable nations? Where have you been able to see success in the COP negotiations, if at all?
Well, we have had successes. I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't feel that we had a chance. But it's not a level playing field, all right? It is a highly politicized and political place where the rich and powerful countries have sway. They are the ones who decide. The poor and vulnerable countries don't. Nevertheless, it is the only place where the poor and vulnerable countries have a say. We have a seat at the table, even if people aren't listening to us. And so what I do with the vulnerable country negotiators is I've been doing this for many years, and I can see we have a friend of mine who has been working with me for many years, Benito Muller from Oxford. We train the negotiators from the least developed countries, because negotiations can be highly complex and complicated. They're not easy to understand, particularly if you're not a full-time negotiator. And so we train them, we enable them to learn how to do more effective, and the most effective means is collective action. If we get countries to come together and say, this is what we want, and if we don't get what we want, we will not agree to anything you want. It's the only way it's how we got the Warsaw International Mechanism in COP19, by the way. We stood them down. We said, we want this mechanism. If you don't give it to us, there's going to be no result in Warsaw. We'll all go home from Warsaw without anything, and we'll blame you. You can blame us, but we'll call it. We showed them down, and they blinked, and they gave us the mechanism. In Glasgow, they didn't blink. They didn't remove our demand, but they downgraded it to a dialogue. And so, okay, we're now going to do the dialogue. We will do the dialogue. It's better than nothing, but it isn't what we wanted. And so I guess the answer is collective action, being clever about what we want to do, and perseverance, not giving up.
Yeah, great, thank you. So another question related to the COP process, and then we'll move on a bit from that. But Leanne was asking, how optimistic are you that the stakeholders will kind of follow and galvanize around some of the agreements that have been made so far? There was sort of a lot of conversation about India's last minute change to the precise wording and whether that was really of any importance or not. But we've got lots of wording on the table about our
Mm.
ambitions globally and from those negotiations. How optimistic are you about the success based on that?
Well, I always remain optimistic. I'm an eternal optimist, so I don't want to give up. But I am also a realist in the sense that I realize that words alone don't matter. And as Greta Thunberg quite aptly said, it's all blah, blah, blah until you do something. And what we have achieved is words. They've agreed to do things. What we haven't achieved is make them do the things they agreed to do. They're not doing it. And so we need to be putting pressure on them to do it and make it happen and not give up. And so to me, it's an incremental process. We're not going to have huge achievements, but we can still move in the right direction if we get enough countries to move in the right direction together and bring others on board and build alliances. The good thing now, in my view, is that we have the Paris Agreement. All countries have agreed to that. The United States went out under Trump. It's come back under Biden. So there's nobody outside the Paris Agreement. And they've all agreed to do things. They're not just doing it fast enough. So it's about implementing things as quickly as possible, not agreeing new things to do. We don't need new agreements anymore. Glasgow was not about a new agreement. It was about implementing things we've already agreed. And so that allows all of us to take actions. All of us can implement the Paris Agreement. It doesn't need our governments. It needed the governments to make the agreement, but it doesn't need them to be the only ones to implement the agreement. The implementation can be done by any means. City mayors can do it, governors of states can do it, company CEOs can do it, and you and I can do it as citizens. We can all implement the Paris Agreement. And that's really what we need to be focusing our attention on.
Very well said. Thanks, Saleemul. So moving on from COP and the global negotiations a little bit, let's say for some reason the loss and damage fund really took off and went very well, and money was no object. What would you say, what would you feel are the most impactful or most important climate mitigation or adaptation activities that you just can never ever otherwise imagine the funding for, that you would really struggle to justify the funding, but that you feel are really important?
Well, I would say I never regard funding as the sine qua non, or new funding as an essential first step. The first step is actually people realizing what needs to be done. Knowledge, capacity, understanding, willingness to engage. That to me is a far more powerful force than is there enough money. There's never enough money. If you get bogged down into talking about money, then you are basically tying your own hands and saying, well, there's not enough money to solve the problem, so the problem is insoluble. It isn't insoluble. If we start tackling it at our own level, it is soluble. We can do it. Now, if we want to scale up, we will need more resources. And part of our actions will be, how do we get those additional resources? How do we get people with money who might be willing to put that money into supporting the actions that we do, but not asking for money first, but doing something with it? And just to mention what is happening with the funding that Nicola Sturgeon started, we are in discussions now about doing some practical things to demonstrate the value of taking action to deal with the impacts of climate change. I mentioned that no country is actually prepared for climate change impacts at the moment. Every country needs to be better prepared. And that means the citizens of the country need to be aware of what needs to be done, and they need to know what to do. And then once they know what to do, they do it when it happens. And then when it happens, everybody jumps in and helps each other to deal with it. And that really is a description of what Bangladesh is. Bangladesh, we don't have finance capital, we have social capital. People know what to do. People prepare themselves. When the events happen, people tackle them and help each other to tackle them. And when they're over, people help each other to deal with the problems after they've happened. It's people to people exchange of knowledge, information, sympathy, solidarity that is by far the more important element than whether governments step in with more money or less money. Governments are always going to be coming in late, coming in with inadequate amounts of money, even if they have more money than others. Some countries will have more money than others. They are really second order responders. The first order responders are people themselves, and people themselves need to be capacitated and provided with the knowledge and the ability to do what they need to do.
Absolutely. I think that concept of social capital is absolutely vital. So yeah, great stuff. And that leads on to another great question, which came from Carl, which is, what is your, you've sort of touched on it, I think, but what is your vision, if we could reach a point where we said, all right, we did it. This is the world as it should be. How do you imagine that looking, and what would it be for you?
Well, I now have redirected my major effort. As I said, I go to the COP every year, but that's only 2 weeks of my year. The other 50 weeks of the 52 weeks in the year, I'm on the ground working with vulnerable countries. And in particular, I'm a professor in a university. So I have lots of young, bright students. And to me, the next generation, the students of universities and other young people around the world are the future. They are the ones who will make the changes happen that their adults were not able to do. And to me, the global divide on this issue is now increasingly an old versus young divide across the board in all countries, rather than a rich versus poor divide. Rich versus poor is true, it's important, both rich within a country against poor people in their own country, and rich countries in the globe versus poor countries. But even in every single country, whether it's rich or poor, young people versus old people is a much, much more significant divide, and a much more important divide. Young people everywhere are our allies, everywhere, in all countries, including in the developed countries. Just to give you one example, President Biden became president by getting more votes from than President Trump. A large part of that came from young people in the United States. Young voters were a very significant element in taking him over the hump in terms of getting elected into the White House. And as a result, the young people, for them, climate change was a big issue. Biden never took climate change as a big issue. He never had a history of understanding or doing anything on climate change. But once he got elected into office by young people, they forced him to take climate change seriously, and he now does. At least he talks the talk, even if he's not walking the walk and he's having trouble in Congress with his legislation. Nevertheless, the US actions on climate change of the administration of old people is driven by a very large extent by young people in the Democratic Party, pushing their older leaders to take actions that they're actually doing reluctantly. Their heart's not in tackling climate change, but they know they have to do it for their young voters. So young people can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Thanks, Saleemul. So we're coming up to the last few minutes now. So thank you everyone for the great questions so far. I've just been trying to read through and figure out which ones we've tried to answer and which are left. So there's one here which I think is just worth digging into, going back a little bit towards, well, how do we kind of add pressure, and if we're struggling to add pressure on a national scale. You talked about how we can take action, local governments and businesses and kind of citizens, social spaces as well. Where have you seen that happening? So, for example, at the US state level instead of the federal level, at the city government level instead of a national level, if the national government is failing. Any kind of inspiring examples that you've come across where you've seen that going on at a more localized level that in a way gives people a bit more tangible access to what's happening, whether it's government or maybe businesses or communities?
Sure. So I'll give you the example that I'm most familiar with, which is my own country in Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, I've described a little bit of what the country has been able to do. But one of the most significant aspects of what we have done is to be able to make tackling climate change into what I call a whole of society issue, and not just something that the government is responsible for. If you were to visit Bangladesh and talk to people, everybody knows about climate change. I often say the Bangladeshi average citizen knows more about climate change than any other country. And I'll give you a metric of why I say that. In Glasgow, when we had the COP in Glasgow, we had leaders from all over the world fly in for the initial, leaders part of the meeting, and then they did their speeches, and there was huge media coverage, and then they all flew out and left, and we had 2 weeks of negotiations, and the media left. Most of the media were not there anymore, and so we, and then at the very end, when we had the results come out, the media came back and reported the results. But in the case of Bangladesh media, there were 3 private television channels that spent money, their own money, to send television crews to Glasgow, who were reporting the negotiations every single day. They would report live from Glasgow to a general audience of public in Bangladesh on what happened in the negotiations today, and then what happened yesterday, and who said what. And so the public in Bangladesh were following every single day of the negotiations on different aspects of the negotiations in a way that the people in Glasgow themselves didn't know. And so that shows you the level of knowledge and interest that public can have to do something, learn something, and then do something about it. And that is genuinely what is happening in the country now. Everybody knows about climate change. Everybody is now doing something about it. And we are collectively trying to build our resilience to tackle the impacts of climate change. They're going to happen whether we like it or not, but we now intend to be able to cope with them and overcome them. We're not going to let them defeat us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Saleemul. I think that's, I'd love to dig in and spend more time talking about the role of media and press coverage and how that shapes so much of our political and ecological society. But I'm conscious of the time, and I'm really, really grateful to you for being with us for this hour, and especially I know it's now quite late in Bangladesh as well. So I'm going to call us to a close, and I'm sorry to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. This always happens, but hopefully you've still enjoyed the session and all of the insights. I certainly have. Thank you, Saleemul, again so much for spending your time with us. And I hope folks do look up the conference that you talked about in March.
My pleasure. And if anybody wants to get in touch, please do share my email address. I'd be happy to respond to anybody who wants to contact me. Great.
Fantastic.
Nice meeting you, everybody. Good luck with the rest of your course.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.